Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Jody Chiera, head of golf at K-Motion. We're going to be going through what are swing characteristics, how can we identify those swing characteristics in the graph, and then most importantly, what biofeedback activities and programs can we build to train the improvement of these swing characteristics of our players. So during this webinar, we're going to go through three of what I feel are the top swing characteristics that we see in our golfers. Flat shoulders, reverse spine angle, and over the top. Right? So all three are more upper body related swing characteristics, and they're very common amongst many of the golfers that we see. So the first thing I'll do is I'll go into the graphs, and I will show you where you can see these swing characteristics show up in the graph. And I'll also show you some residual effects that might occur in other areas of the body in the kinematic sequence as maybe a negative effect that occurs from these swing characteristics. And then I'll go into the train function of the software, and I will show you what I would do if I had this player in front of me and what type of biofeedback programs I would build for them. So the first one we're going to go into is flat shoulders. So I'm going to turn my camera off, and you'll see just my software for the time being. All right. So I've got flat shoulders pulled up. You can see I named this player flat shoulders for that purpose for our webinar. And I'm going to go into the motions tab. And I'll go ahead and select the motion and go into performance graphs. So we're going to go first to the part of the graphs that would allow you to identify and know for sure this player has flat shoulders. So if I go into the upper body angles, we know the flat shoulders is an upper body related swing characteristic, and it's a swing characteristic that is speaking to the side bend of the upper body. So we're looking at the blue line, which is upper body side bend, and what we're going to determine is if they have enough side bend or lead shoulder lower than the trail shoulder at the top of their backswing. So I first look at what is the actual value of side bend at the top. So I'll hit the T key down here. It'll snap me to the top of the swing, and I'll look right over here at the bottom right, the blue color upper body side bend, and we can see that we have just a shade over 27 degrees with the lead shoulder lower than the trail shoulder. So that's pretty low in the big scheme of things, but how I can validate this is to look at what their upper body bend, forward bend was, starting the golf swing. So if I go back to address, I look at upper body bend, 47.2. So we went from 47.2, and then when we get to the top, we do want to see the upper body side bend somewhat around the same as the upper body bend at address. We can see here that it's 20 degrees less, which is very significant, and that's going to classify as flat shoulder. So this could lead to many issues, but the most common, I would say, would be thin shots and potentially pulls, depending upon how the player changes direction in their transition. But most certainly from a flat shoulder position, we're going to see thin shots occur as an effect of that. So this is how we can see in the graph that this player has flat shoulders. So just a couple other things to point out to you that might occur and that you could be aware of with your players that are effects of the flat shoulders. So again, I would fix the flat shoulders first and see how these other things start to change as a result. But we can see because the player had flat shoulders and lost stability in their upper body, they've almost gotten to 100 degrees of rotation with their upper body rotation graph. So that's significantly more than we would see with most players who are staying stable with their bend and their side bend up to the top of the swing. So remember, when you lose stability in the bend or the side bend, it might have a player to rotate more, but it's not necessarily functional rotation. It might be more of like fake rotation, right? That they can't take advantage of because they're in an unleveraged position at that point in time in their swing. So that's just something to be aware of. The other thing that you want to pay attention to is the kinematic sequence, of course, right? So with the kinematic sequence, it's really speaking to the athleticism and how that player is able to transfer energy from the ground through their body and out into the club. So a couple of things that really stick out at me, and you'll see this commonly when players do run into certain swing faults. The transition sequence, which I'll highlight for all of you. The transition sequence is the order that each line crosses through the zero axis from below it to above it, right in that area there. So we can see that the pelvis, the red line, and the green line, or the upper body, are crossing almost identically at the same time. So there's really no separation between the lower body and the upper body. And that continues all the way throughout the downswing, right? So if I go ahead and take off the arm and take off the club, if we look here, not only were they together when they crossed, but you can see that both of these lines are right on top of one another all the way past the middle of the downswing. So the pelvis is never really accelerating more than the torso. So there's never really any separation. There's not a lot of core loading going on in this particular player where the pelvis is stretching and creating additional stretch against the torso segment before the torso starts to speed up. So not to say that this is directly related to that one swing fault, but it very well could, right? When we see players lose stability, they lose their ability to use the ground and to create energy from segment to segment. So those are just a couple things that you might find as just residual effects that you want to pay attention to while you're starting to correct some of your player's swing characteristics. All right. So if we went and looked at an efficient example of an upper body side bend, we can go in here and take a look. And now you can see in this particular example, this player started at 48 degrees of forward bend, and they were at 36 degrees of side bend. So again, about 10 degrees of difference, maybe 12 in this particular player. So again, borderline, right? But much closer with the side bend to that 40-degree mark. I would say, if anything, this player, who is me, is starting out a little bit higher than we want with the bend, right? So I tend to get a little bit rounded. If I really worked on my posture, I'm more around like 42 to 41 when I'm hitting it really well when I start. And then that to the 36-degree mark, now we're within 5 degrees and we've got a nice stable rotation in terms of the transfer from bend to side bend and at the top of the swing. So again, that's just something to keep in mind with where you're looking at for an efficient example. All right, so to train this, I would start with bended address. Okay, and you can leave the full body up. If you need to take a segment away, you always can, but I always want to start with that full body at address. Then we know that side bend at the top with the upper body is something that we pay attention to because that is what flat shoulders would be. So I'm going to go into my edit screen. I'm just going to take away the pelvis and leave the upper body on because that's all I want to see. But even before that, I'm very big on the takeaway, getting things started out correctly. So I'm going to add a third one in here, which is the takeaway 2040, which gives me some good separation between pelvis and torso early in my takeaway. But now it's at the end of my program. So just remember, you can take this, select it, drag it in order, right? So now it's between my address and my top, which is where it should be. So what this would look like is if I launch this program, train all activities. Okay, so now if I come in here and I grab a golf club, I can get into my posture. I'll link them so that they're same, it's points on the same swing. Okay, so I'll get in my posture. Then I will make sure that the upper body starts to take away and I get into that 20-40 position. And then I'll work my way up to the top of my swing to the side bend mark. And then it'll take me right back to bend at address. Okay, so that's how I would work through this 3-point program to help correct flat shoulders. All right, so we're going to move on now to the next swing fault. That one is reverse spine angle. No, I don't want to save my program. Go into these graphs now. Okay, so the graph that's going to show you whether your player is in reverse spine angle is, again, it's an upper body fault. So we're going to go to the upper body graphs and we're paying attention to one area. Okay, we're going to look at the green line at the top of the swing. Okay, that's the upper body bend. And if it goes into the negative values or below the 0 axis, you are more than likely going to be in reverse spine angle. Now, the degree at which you go into reverse spine angle is also important. So as I measure and I look at reverse spine angle, I do it all relative around 90-ish degrees, okay, of rotation. So when a player is at 90 degrees of rotation, if they are in negative bend or extension, this particular player is in almost 4 degrees of extension at that point in time, I'm going to be aware of this potentially for reverse spine angle. Now, sometimes when players rotate more than 90 degrees, they go into more extension than they would be at 90 degrees. But just remember, you only want to go into more rotation if you're able to keep your stability with the upper body bend and side bend. So in this particular case, not only did I see this player lose their stability with bend going into extension, but I also see this player losing side bend, okay, at the top, right? So when we get to the top of the swing, not only have they started to go into that extension or that reverse spine, but they are at about 33 degrees of side bend, which means they're starting to even lose the shoulder tilt at the top of the swing to get into the amount of rotation that they feel that they need to get up to the top. So those are the areas where you really want to pay attention to, okay? This is a big one because this is one of the biggest causes of back pain in the golf swing. If you have a player that goes into reverse spine angle and then starts the downswing with a lot of speed, you're just asking for trouble when it comes to how long they're going to be able to play pain-free. Now, this one only goes into about 8.5 degrees of extension or negative bend, okay? You will see players go much more than this, especially your more mobile, less stable players like females and juniors. I've seen juniors that have upwards of 20 to 25 degrees of reverse spine angle at the top, and it's just, it's a matter of stability, but also it's something you really need to pay attention to because it can certainly cause them back pain, even at a young age, okay? I've seen juniors that come to me that have been with maybe other teachers or have just kind of been on their own, and they have back pain at 13 years old, and then you look at them, and they've got that 25 degrees of extension. So the next thing we want to do is take a look at another graph or other graphs and see how they are affected. So if we go into the pelvis angles, okay, one of the things that you'll commonly see when a player is in reverse spine angle is a higher than normal pelvis side bend. All right, so if I highlight where that is, if I look at the blue line at its max value, which is right around here at the top, doesn't really increase much of the downswing, and I bring that over, you know, I'm looking at about 20 degrees. I know we've got 16.9 right here, so 17 degrees of side bend at the top with the pelvis. So that means that the trail hip was 17 degrees higher than the lead hip when the player rotated up to the top of their swing. So why that's important to note is when your player is rotating, okay, let me grab a golf club and show all of you. When your player is rotating in the backswing and their trail hip goes excessively higher and they rotate the upper body, it's very easy to start to pitch the upper body back to the target, right? So if I showed you this way, if I start to load into my backswing and my trail hip goes very high and then I rotate, I'm already starting to lean this way without even focusing on my upper body because my trail hip being so much higher than my lead hip, right, is going to start to pitch me that way. You can combine that with, you know, if you're familiar with a sway, you know, a sway would be a linear fall, but it's very closely coupled with high side bend and then that reverse spine angle. Okay, that's like a domino effect of swing characteristics that we would commonly see. So with that being said, pay attention to this because this could be some low-hanging fruit and something that's earlier in the chain that can help you minimize your reverse spine angle while getting your player to have better swing dynamics and not try and manufacture something that kind of could take care of itself potentially or drastically be reduced as a result. So how one more thing before we go into the training. Again, if we look at how this affects the player's overall movement patterns in terms of velocity and how they are able to load and create energy through their body, it really does a number on how the player can accelerate and change directions, just like the last example. So we can clearly see right in here when everything's changing direction that they're all changing directions somewhat together. And then once they do change directions, the club's on top, the lead arm is the next fastest, then the torso, then the pelvis is the slowest because it's on the bottom. We call this fanning because it kind of looks like a fan as they start to peel apart from left to right. And this is the most prohibitive for creating efficient speed or power in your golf swing. Okay, this is more of a top-down acceleration pattern where they're not really taking advantage at all of the segments below, the more proximal segments to the ground, the ones that can add much, much more energy into the system. So therefore, they're having to overwork with the arm and the club, really. And it's just a very inefficient way of getting the job done, especially for trying to hit the golf ball a long way. But they really have no choice because of the position their body's in. So this is a result of that. So how I would train this is I would again go into my train button here. And I know that I always want to start with bended address. All right. The reason being, which I didn't mention before, but I will now, when you have a player that starts out poorly with their address, hold on one second. Let me just take a look at my camera here. Okay. When you have a player that is in more of an S posture to start, okay, more extension of the upper body to start, then typically when they are more arched in the lower back and more arched here or more upright with their torso, and then they start to rotate, it's already putting them into that extension type of a position, right? So bend and address is really, really important to be able to get that player to have more of a hip hinge, neutral upper body instead of a more of an S posture where when they take the club away, they have to go into that extension because they're just really more of a head start from when they were at address. So pay attention to that. I would start with bend and address. Then I would tell you, I would then go, as you know from the last one, I like to do something between address and top because there's so much space in there that you can start the pattern off better rather than waiting till you get to the top. So I'm going to load up side bend at the top, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to edit this, and I'm going to go side bend, half back. So let's call it lead arm parallel to the ground. Take off the torso, just the pelvis, go to advanced view, and I want it to be -8 plus or minus 5, which means once it gets to -3, I'm going to get the tone. I want a little more than that. So I'm going to go -10 plus or minus 5. That means once I get to -5, I get the tone, okay? So I want to do that so that once they get to -5, they're going to try and stabilize there and keep it there all the way up to the top of the swing, okay? So I'm going to close this. And then I'm also going to go bend at the top, which we know is what reverse spine angle is, upper body bend. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to take off the pelvis, just focus on the upper body. And I'm going to give this 6 plus or minus 6. So once it goes past 0, they lose the tone. Okay, so there's my program. I'm going to launch this. Train all activities. It's linked already. So I'll just step in. I'll go ahead and get my posture first. Okay, and then as I work the club back, okay, that's halfway back for me. And then from there, I'm going to rotate up to the top of my swing and try and stay stable with my upper body so that I don't go into reverse, right? So if I did this poorly, I would go here, and then I'd go right into my reverse spine angle. I go through that tone, right? I want to make sure as I'm working my way up to the top, I'm not going past 0, okay? So that would be a good program for your reverse spine angle, okay? Now let's go to the last one here. One of the most common swing faults. Over the top. Okay, so over the top is an interesting one because it's really, you got to read between the lines to be able to see it because it's more a fault of the club and arm obviously moving off the body, but we can infer that it's happening with our data, and I'll show you how you can do that. So it's an upper body graph again, and you're going to look at two things. You're going to look at the side bend line, and you're going to look at the rotation line. All right, let me pull my camera up. Okay. So over the top, we know is the golfer that moves out, the handle out, and the club out towards the ball early in their downswing, right? So if I'm a player that gets up to the top of my swing and I don't change side bends but I change rotation. So I start rotating, but my side bend doesn't change, okay? With lower body usually and upper body, right? So when the right hip stays high and I start to rotate, right, you see a lot of golfers push off that right leg, the right hip goes higher. That means the right shoulder is going to shoot out, and the club usually shoots out to the golf ball, right? That's our chain reaction usually that happens when we have an over-the-top type of a swing. So when I'm here and I look at my upper body, okay, I want my side bend to change simultaneously as my rotation starts to move back to the target, okay? If it doesn't, I start working out that way. So what we're going to pay attention to is right here at the top, when we see the change in direction, we're going to notice two things. We're going to notice the side bend continues to increase slightly, and the rotation from its max to the same point in the swing has changed by, let's call it 10 to 12 degrees. So that means that in that phase, I have not only started to change directions with my torso by 12-ish degrees, 10 to 12 degrees, but my side bend has also increased. So side bend increased, rotation changed directions, and you can see what that's doing to the golf club. Okay, you might not see it always increase, but you're certainly going to see it stay flat, well into the blue line, flat, well into the downswing, which means the torso side bend doesn't change directions, okay, which means I don't start to level out, and I change directions with the upper body rotation, okay? Both of those, how that look at the top of the swing is indication that the player is going over the top, all right? So a couple other things to pay attention to. Just take these highlighters off. Pelvis angles. Remember I told you what the lower body does is an influence on the upper body. So this player has 10 degrees of side bend at the top. By the time they get to the middle of their downswing, they have increased it to 13. That's only 3 degrees, but it's a big deal when it comes to what's happening in the downswing, how little time we have in the downswing to get the club moving the right way. We have, 0.3 seconds, right, or less. And we need to be able to move the right way early to get the club in a position during the delivery phase to be able to hit the golf ball well. So this is certainly going to affect the upper, right? Because we can also see here, this line has kind of mirrored that last one that I drew there with the pelvis increase. All right, so side bend's increasing, rotation is decreasing. That is essentially going to show you the player has over the top. Right, so if we go to the kinematic sequence, we can see that the loading patterns, what's moving the fastest? Well, right off the bat, after it changes direction, boom, lead arm is going faster than everything else. So that tells us that it's moving out off the body. It's not waiting for the other segments to accelerate. So all of these kind of adding up definitely shows me we've got a player that's going to suffer from over the top. So now how are we going to train that? So we're going to go to train. Okay. Let me get my home screen up. Train. Again, I'm big on address. I'm always going to start with that. And then from here, This is where we don't really need to talk much about backswing because this is more of a transition fault. So we'll go top, right? Side bend at the top. And then we're going to go side bend half down. So I've got bend at address, 42. Let me just hold on one second. Bend at address is good. Side bend at the top. I'm going to just do the upper body. And then actually side bend halfway down will be just pelvis. And I'm going to want to get it to 0 plus or minus 5. So I can start to shallow out the club and not get over the top. So I'm going to launch this, train all activities. Okay, so now set up, get in my bend, okay, side bend at the top, and level out the pelvis by the time I get halfway down. Okay, so let's go through that again. Let me just change the views here. V key changes the view for you. So I want that perspective view. So I'll relink them. Okay, bend, posture. And then level it out. Right? So I'm going to level out the pelvis. Let me show you on video why I do that. Okay, so why I level out the pelvis is because when I get up to the top, remember, if the right hip stays high, then usually the right side can stay high, the club works out. If I get up to the top and I start to level out the pelvis, you can see what the club does as a result. It kind of follows and it starts to fall and shallow, okay? So that right there is a good way to get up moving in a right position by about lead arm parallel without really ever having to talk about what the hands and club are doing. It's just going to start to move the club in the right way based on the body and the pelvis starting to level and shallow out the club. Okay, so that would be my 3-point program to help correct over the top. Okay, so that's going to conclude our 3 swing faults that we're going to go through today. So I'm just going to turn my camera back on here for everyone. Okay, so what we'll do is you will see an email from myself with the video link. So all I'd like you to do is go ahead and watch this. We'll announce next week's webinar as well when we send this out. So we hope you can join us next week, and we hope for sure that we don't have as many technical problems. So I want to thank all of you for your patience. Thank you for joining, and we hope to see you next week.